everybody, my name is Bree. This is my final video project, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the beginning of the women's rights movements. So for this project, my thesis was the Seneca Falls Convention passed the Declaration of Sentiments, which was the turning point for many American women. The Declaration allowed women to become activists for political, social, and economic equality, which began their fights for equal rights, which continues today. So first of all, I wanted to talk about who attended the conference, who was there, and why was it such a big deal, basically. This conference was organized by 5 main women:
Lucretta Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Jane Hunt, Martha Coffin Wright, and Mary McClintock.
Another major person that attended the conference was Frederick Douglass, which, if you don't know who that is, he is an escaped slave who became a major abolitionist and also supported women's suffrage. And so when we look at what he did for this conference and women's rights, you will see that he played a major role in getting the 9th resolution passed, which is incredibly important in the history of women's rights, which I'll talk about more later. So this was a 2-day conference, and the first day was exclusively women. There was no men, and then the second day was open to the public, and about 40 men joined them. So July 19th, 1848, 200 women read aloud the Declaration of Sentiments, which is what the convention had formed when they got together and figured out what they wanted to change. So 68 women and 32 men ended up signing the declaration, but unfortunately, once it was announced into the public and there was criticism and ridicule, a lot of those signees retracted their signature. Women's suffrage movement is a whole other thing, but they're kind of tied together because this convention was the beginning of the women's suffrage movement, which Frederick Douglass explains in this excerpt. Let me read it to you. He said, "I have been thinking more or less of this scene presented 40 years ago in the little Methodist church at Seneca Falls, the manager in which this organized suffrage movement was born. It was a very small thing then. It was not then big enough to be abused, or loud enough to make itself heard outside, and only a few of those who saw it had any notion that the little thing would live. I have been thinking, too, of the strong conviction, the noble courage, the sublime faith in God and man it required at that time to set this suffrage ball in motion." So what I'm getting from that is that the convention, the Seneca Falls Convention, was the beginning of the women's suffrage movement, and it was small. It was a baby when it was at the convention, and now when he's talking about it here 40 years later, it's major problem, major movement, and I just wanted to focus on the part of this expert where he's talking about the fact that the women's suffrage movement was born at the Seneca Falls Convention. So then I took a look at what the Declaration actually said. So when we dive into it, we see that it was drafted mainly by Elizabeth Stanton, and it was considered a declaration of rights for women. So it was based off of America's Declaration of Independence, but it was focused on women and women's rights and what they could do in the country. One of its main lines was that all men and women are created equal. This is a major thing because it takes what Declaration says, all men are created equal, and includes women as a group and a species. Aside from where it stated that all men and women are created equal, the Declaration said and detailed the injustices upon which women in the U.S. were living under, and it called upon women to stand up for themselves and petition for their own rights. So really what this whole convention aimed to do was ignite a women's movement. It aimed to point out what was wrong, and then from there make everybody want to fix it. Make women mad, make them upset, make them want something to change. It also argued in it that women were oppressed by their government and their society, and then it lists 16 examples of this. So again, trying to make people upset, trying to make women want some change. And then it went on to state that women had unalienable rights to life, which are in the Declaration as well. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. So the first day, it was not signed by anyone, it was just read aloud. It was the women they were meeting. Then the second day, it was adopted and signed by the Assembly, and then went on and passed 12 resolutions related to women's rights, which I mentioned one of them earlier, that related to the suffrage movement, that I will continue to talk about as we continue. So the Declaration also demanded that women be considered full citizens of the U.S. and that they get the same rights and privileges that are given to men. So if we know anything about history during this time, we see a lot of oppression and a lot of problems with a lot of different kinds of citizens. There's the Chinese, the Japan, the Native Americans. They don't want anybody to be a full U.S. citizen unless you're a white man, and that doesn't exclude women either, because women did not have the same rights as men. And so this declaration aimed to bring light to that and solve it. So the main arguments presented were for equality within politics, family, education, jobs, religion, and morals, which I will go on to explain some specifics of those as we continue. So as I mentioned, there were 12 resolutions, and only one of them did not pass unanimously, which was the one that Frederick Douglass, the 9th resolution, had to push for. He had to advocate for, and that one was the one about women's suffrage, women's right to vote. A lot of people thought it was too controversial and that it would scare off supporters, and that they were asking for too much too soon. But Frederick Douglass stuck up for himself, and he was able to push it through and pass the resolution, which is really good. So before the whole convention even started, Elizabeth Stanton gave a speech. And in this speech, she talks about the goals and purposes of the convention, which I already mentioned some of them earlier. So if you can pick them out of this, that would be really good, and you would really be understanding what I'm trying to say here. So I'm going to read that right now. We are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support, to have such disgraceful laws as give man the power to chastise and imprison his wife, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and, in case of separation, the children of her love. So as you can see, she basically just highlights all of the problems that she's going to address and hopefully work to change within the future, and what she mentioned at the convention. So when we look at the effects of this convention, we see that it affected women politically, socially, and economically. So politically, the meeting was met with hostility. It was changed. Nobody likes that. Nobody wants that. Men don't want to give women more power. Like, it's just not what anybody really wanted to say. So obviously, politically, women did not have the right to own property. If they inherited it, it would either, and they didn't have a man to give it to, I'm pretty sure it would go to the government or like a brother or something. Like, they would not get the property. They could not own property. So that was a major issue that they wanted to solve, because they felt it was unfair and unjust that they couldn't inherit their inheritance. They also were talking about representation within the government. Women wanted to be able to voice what they needed, what their expectations were, and they had no one to do that. Nobody knew how, nobody cared how the laws that they were passing would affect women. Nobody in the government was looking out for women, which was causing a lot of turmoil and bad blood, if you could say. In the declaration, they were so upset, and there's an excerpt or a part that says that that women should throw off such a government. They should wipe it out, put something else new in there, a new system that represents everybody, makes everybody feel equal and welcome. I have been mentioning throughout this whole video, the meeting was the birth of the suffrage movement, which was, if you didn't know, it was a 72-year fight, and it was finally passed, and women could finally vote in 1920, just a short 100 years ago, which is crazy to think, like, some of our grandparents couldn't vote. That's crazy. So when we look at the effects of this convention and women's rights socially, we see that women's educational rights were a major point that they mentioned. Women were in different schools learning different things than what men were, and they didn't like that. They wanted to be educated the same way and have the same opportunities to go on and get better jobs from what they had been able to learn, which was also another major point. Women could not find jobs very well that were anything that would have an impact on society. If you listen to the last little bit of Stanton's speech, she mentions in the end that women would not be able to have the children if they get into a divorce, which was a major problem, because women, their main job was to take care of the kids. So if you get divorced because your boyfriend or your husband's an asshole, he gets the kids no matter what, even though you spent every day with them and you taught them and you loved them and you cared for them. And a lot of women didn't think that that was right, and they wanted it to change, and this convention really sparked that, and it sought out to change it. So the last part that I wanted to look at was economically. Now, economically, women's husbands owned any money that they had earned, which was a major problem and was advocated to change. So let's say you get an inheritance because your dad dies, and then you get married. It goes to your husband. You don't get any of the money. You have zero money to your name. Your husband has all the money. And obviously you can see that that's a problem if anyone ever gets divorced, or like you want to buy anything, you have to ask your husband first. And as I mentioned earlier, property was another concept, and they wanted to have the right to get their own and have the right to inherit it. Yeah, those are like the major problems that were presented and attempted to change. And when we look at going forward, when some of these things were actually changed, we see that it's taken like years and years to actually see some change. So in the 1890s, we see some women integrating into our government system. We see some women finally getting a voice, finally being able to tell these men in power how their decisions are affecting women, and hopefully allow them to see that women have their own opinions on men's decisions as well. By the 1900s, all states had made it legal for women to own land. And then in 1868, 20 years after the convention, the fight for equal pay within the workforce and just really the economy in general had begun, which is still a problem today. A lot of women make I think it's 23 cents less than whatever a man makes per dollar or something along those lines. We also saw Elizabeth Stanton found the Women's Suffrage Association in 1869, which, as I mentioned, we got the right to vote in 1920. So, yeah, and then when we look at it today in women's rights, we see that there's still a big argument about reproductive rights at the moment. The Roe v. Wade, the overturning the states' rights. It's just all crazy right now. So obviously this is a problem that has started a long time ago and is continuing today. But we've definitely made a lot of progress, and the Seneca Falls Convention was really the beginning of that for a lot of American women. And yeah, I hope you learned so much about women's rights.